Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where I talk about the crime dramas that I like that I'm currently watching. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episodes of Blindspot as well as Castle. First up in Blindspot, we have picks up right where the last episode off with Jane talking to that guy, and he basically gives Jane a mission. Essentially, the mission is to take the specific pen he gives her and have her swap it out with the pen that Mayfair uses. She even takes time out to kind of like break the pen down just to see if it was anything special about it. It just turns out to be a normal pen. Later on, Jane pieces it together that this whole thing was just essentially a trust mission, basically to see, loyalty mission, I really should say, to see if she'd actually go through with it or not. Basically, we have Kurt coming to Jane earlier in the episode, lying about the fact is that during the whole where they were supposed to rendezvous, because we know she didn't show because she was meeting with that guy. Kurt actually showed up, but he pretended like he didn't, because his sister brings it up. She's like, "Oh, where were because he learns that his sister's dating somebody, and then she's like, "Oh, well, what about you? Where were you at last night?" And he doesn't answer. He was off waiting for Jane. She never showed up. But anyway. He tells her, it's like, yeah, he's sorry for not showing up, and that, he didn't mean to have her waiting, even though he knows she didn't come, but he's making it seem like he didn't come. Just assume that she was there waiting for him and that he didn't come. So it was his way of handling the whole situation. He was like, I think it's best if we just leave things as they are. We just keep a professional relationship, and this way things don't get weird and awkward. And Jane's like, yeah, I totally agree. Mainly her reason for it is just because this whole other business she's currently caught up in, this whole plan that's apparently hers, it kind of, it's kind of got her a little scattered, and she just doesn't really know what to do and what to believe in right now. So Jane's tattoo this week leads to a soldier named Charlie who had supposedly died. There's like an IED or something. And he recently popped up and caught notice of the team because he kind of lost control and ended up killing 3 people and injuring 1 person. Patterson had already looked at this tattoo and discovered the name associated with the soldier. Charlie's name was associated with the tattoo. She had already discovered that earlier, before this episode, but it's just she didn't act upon it because at that time that soldier was believed to be dead. So we end up finding out that basically he has a lot of drugs in his system. Him, as well as a few other soldiers who had went missing in similar circumstances, were part of an experiment by this, what's their name, North Lane or North Lake. It's basically like a military contracting company who basically were trying to create the perfect soldiers, and they were all non-willing participants who had their deaths faked and were taken without permission. But most noticeably, a very interesting thing that's pointed out is that in Charlie's system is a drug, not the exact drug that's in Jane's system, the one that wiped her memories. So this case might have something to do with her, which in Jane's mind, while she's all finding this out, because Kurt's like, we need to, find out what happened to him, because this might have to do with what happened to Jane. Jane's worried because she knows that she's the one that did this to herself, so she's worried, what if she and the group she's with has something to do with what happened to Charlie? You end up finding out that actually she doesn't, because she actually eventually gets the answer later on in the episode. She has the group she's apparently working with, they found out about that drug study, that specific drug that's they used on Jane. Found out about it through that experiments. They heard about the experiments, and they used that drug because they found out it would fit her needs. So Jane and them had nothing to do with it. Jane and Charlie's situations had nothing to do with each other. 2 separate issues that just had the only common ground was the drug in that specific drug in their system. You have the very interesting element where Jane asks Kurt about why he's still mad at his dad, why he hasn't really forgiven his dad, even though his dad has been proven innocent. Because the fact is, your dad is proven that your dad had nothing to do with me disappearing all those years ago. And to that, Kurt kind of responds like, it doesn't take away from the fact is he was just a bad dad, with his drinking and stuff. So he says like he's basically saying like there's many other reasons to kind of hate my dad besides you. Later on in the episode, or actually kind of almost close to the end, we have Kurt almost having an almost bonding moment with his dad. He's helping his dad with kind of making a drink. He's sick and dying. So it's like, I guess it's something his sister had recommended for their dad to kind of start drinking this. Something he blends up in the blender. Kurt helps him out. They drink it a little bit. Tell stories back and forth. And then kind of, they're actually laughing and joking around. And then Kurt asks him, like, what happened, that night. And finally, his dad confesses that the fact that night Taylor went missing, he went to go kill himself. He attempted to kill himself, but he just couldn't go through with it. And this entire time, he's lied about it because he was too ashamed to admit that he was going to do that. And it's pretty heavy, dude. It's like, I guess it's just, he didn't want to be, in a sense, he didn't want to be weak. I guess you look at it, he didn't want to be looked at as like weak if people found out that's really what happened, that he was trying to kill himself. He also says like, who really would have believed him? And then Kurt's like pissed. He's like, I would have believed you. He's like, his sister would have believed him just if he had just told him the truth. And he's just like, he said he kept Kurt at a different distance because he himself is dealing with he had this burning rage inside of him, and he didn't want, Kurt to get it. And he just breaks down, and just Kurt's there trying to support him. At one point in this episode, you have Charlie being taken away by the military because of the 3 people he killed them on a military-related area, so it became a military crime. Jane is telling them, like, no, we need to keep Charlie, but Mayfair tells Jane to stand down, that they have jurisdiction over this. But the military doesn't get too far because before long they get attacked. Most of the people there get killed, and Charlie is taken by the military contract group I spoke about earlier, who did experiments on him. Because apparently the doctor in charge is fascinated by Charlie because he's the only one that turned out okay because of the experiments. Everyone else, the other, 4 people that were part of experiments, turned out to be failures. So made very interest. They were very interested in finding out kind of what made him tick, what made him special. Jane and the FBI show up to save him, but before they could get to him, the doctor had already dosed him with more of that drug, so he didn't even remember who they were. And he runs off, and Jane tries to follow him, and because he's in such a heightened state and confused, he ends up fighting Jane, which was kind of a pretty sick fight, though. And you have him about to kill Jane, but then Kurt, shoots him. And after everything, the whole thing is kind of pretty sad because you had his mom, appear in this episode because she had thought her son died was it like a year and a half ago or something like that? And just for him to pop up now and be alive, she was tears in her eyes. She was just praying to God that he was, still alive, even after being told he was dead. She hugged him and everything. She's like, my baby's still alive. See him dragged away, and now, he is dead. 100% dead this time. And it's just, you thought you lost him, you got him back, and just to lose him again, it's kind of heartbreaking. You have Jane mad at Kurt for killing Charlie. Basically saying it was like no needed. Like if Kurt didn't do that, Charlie could have been, talked down. But Kurt's like, no, like Charlie would have killed you. And if it came down to protecting you and, anyone that's a part of my team, I'm not going to second guess myself. I'm going to take the shot. Basically, he was like, there are good people and there are bad people, as simple as that. And Jane's like, it's a lot more complicated than that because, you have Charlie's situation where Charlie wasn't a bad guy. He was just put in a terrible situation because what other people did to him. Secretly, obviously, Kurt doesn't know this angle of it, but Jane's kind of communicating for herself too because she's like, I'm kind of in a complicated situation myself. Because a constant thing throughout this episode, another thing that popped up throughout this episode was Jane getting flashbacks, because the whole situation with Charlie got her remembering her being a part of a quote-unquote military training. I don't know what that really was about. Maybe she was meant to infiltrate it or something, because at the end of it you have her telling her boss, like, ringing that bell, because basically ringing the bell means that you quit the training, that you're done. She said ringing that bell was like the hardest thing she had to do. So I'm guessing it means that she was faking it. She had to pretend like she was struggling, because I guess to make people let her guard down. I don't know. Or maybe it gave her an opportunity to, I don't know. Like, I'm really not understanding that. Maybe we'll get a clearer picture of what that really means. And he tells her, like, oh, this is welcome to Orion. Something, a word she's, heard periodically throughout the season so far. But I get where Jane's coming from, being pissed at Kurt. But it's like, truth be told, is if he didn't act the way he did, like, Jane probably would be dead. But then we also have Jane confronting Mayfair, telling Mayfair, like, she should have done more. She could have saved, if she had pushed more, she could have saved Charlie. But and then Mayfair was like, you need to understand that basically there's a chain of command. We didn't have jurisdiction. If you're going to be a part of this team, you've got to realize that, things don't always work out your way. Just because you want things to go one way doesn't mean they're going to work that way. You're not in a position to make stuff like that happen. And this is, it's pushing more and more towards Jane being like, oh, the FBI, like, they're not the good guys I thought they were. And it's like, it's not like they're trying to do it just to be mean. It's just, I don't know, Kurt's situation, you can be like, he may have seemed a little cold-hearted towards her, but I guess it's like, in his mind, that was his way of dealing with the fact is that she didn't show up. He was kind of deflecting, in a sense. I guess you could look at it like that. But even that conversation with Mayfair upset Jane. And she ends up meeting up with the guy that she's been talking to about this whole situation. And she asks him a couple questions, but he doesn't really give her many answers. And then she asks about Orion. And he tells her that Orion is the place where she died. Now, whether that is metaphorically, as in that's when Taylor died and she went through everything and it gave rise to who she is now, as Jane, all the training she went through to become this whole plan, becoming the person she is now, or whether it means she physically died, maybe momentarily and came back. I don't know. Part of me wants to think it's more metaphorical, but with this show, you never know. It could be the latter, so. Now moving on to Castle. In this week's episode, we have Castle, Haley, and Alexis finding their way in LA. Remember last week's episode, Castle remembered a bit of some of the time he was missing, and that was him in LA. Well, here in LA, he finds himself, at the same time he's investigating, his past, he finds himself mixed up in a new case. This case being tracking down a serial killer known as the Phantom. And apparently the serial killer has been killing on both the East Coast, New York, as well as here in LA on the West Coast. So the latest victim is a guy named Philip. Philip, who had secretly been investigating it, because no one had actually pieced it together that it was all one serial killer until Philip is part of a group known as the Greatest Detective Society. It's kind of like a myth. It's basically a group of detectives who may or may not exist, which they do exist because Philip was a member of them, and they even contact Castle, because this whole thing kind of spans from Castle as well as another member of the Greatest Detective Society called, her name's Kendall, played by the lovely Summer Glau. It's just, I have to refer to her by her name just because I recently learned her name. So it's like, oh, Summer Glau. I get like that every time I see her now. Anyway, basically it's a competition between the two to see who can solve Philip's murder, and whichever one solves his murder ends up taking his place on the Greatest Detective Society's, well, takes his spot. A very interesting thing that came up in this episode is something that I was recently popped in my head. Now, I watch Castle from time to time because it syndicates on TNT. So randomly, when I'm flipping channels, sometimes I'll come across Castle and be like, oh, I really love this episode. I'm gonna sit there and watch it. It's like, oh, this next episode, I love it too. So sometimes I'll sit there and end up watching a lot of older episodes of Castle like that. I think they're currently up to maybe season 6 on TNT, maybe. I don't know. I don't watch it consistently enough to know. I definitely know they're up to at least season 5, but whatever the case may be. Anyway, I had recently been watching Castle, and it kind of popped up in my head. I was like, what about that whole Nikki Heat movie thing? I haven't heard anything about that since, I think, what was season 4, where you had Laura Prepon. She was playing that method actor who's going to play Nikki in the movies. I'm pretty sure that was back in season 4 one. You haven't heard anything about it since that one episode, and this episode brought it up. Apparently, Nikki Heat as a movie series got killed. It's not being picked up as like a series of movies because the first movie did so bad. Apparently, it was mainly because there was like a particular head of the studio that was producing it that kind of kept making changes and not probably going along with the changes that Castle wanted to include in. So the project ended up being a bust, even going farther as calling it like the worst movie ever. It's very interesting. I'm really glad that they included the information because, like I said, it's an element. It's a minor element in the story, but it sells something like I'd almost completely forgotten about until recently, and then they just happened to bring it up. I just thought that was nice. So basically you have, the episode mainly revolving around Kendall and Castle going back and forth, trying to solve this case. One of the best moments in the episode, and I'm sure Castle would agree, is when Kendall is trying to get information from a particular actor who may be the killer. Haley ends up making out with her, and it gets him so interested that he invites both of them to his house. And there, at least, in this whole little scene where he's talking about handcuffing her, but remember at this time they think he's a serial killer, so seeing the handcuffs and talking about he's going to handcuff her and do such like bad things to her, and it's just like every innuendo he hits her with could be substituted as like, oh, it's not a sexual thing he's about to do to you, it's about to be a murderous killer thing he does to you. And he had that moment when Castle and Kendall are away because Kendall kind of just abandoned Haley's running around a table, she's acting like she's playing around with him, but she's actually just a little scared. She doesn't want him to get too close to her. Anyway, all 3 of them get found out, and he finds out, they're investigating him, and it turns out he's not the killer. The particular weapon that was used, he was one of multiple people who ended up getting it. The twist in it is you end up finding out that there's actually 2 killers. The Phantom isn't just one killer, it's 2 killers. That's why there's murders happening in New York and LA. The one in New York is being done by like a screenwriter, like a writer on movies and stuff like that. He ends up getting taken down by Ryan and Esposito. And then the Phantom in LA is the studio head, the very one Castle had met earlier in the episode, the one who pretty much helped tank the Nikki Heat movies. And basically he kind of has a little psychotic moment where he was just like, basically they got thrills off of it. He started killing people because he thought that the writer that he had teamed up with, the other killer, basically was just, he loved his scripts and stuff and kind of wanted to sort of act them out or something like that. He was just telling Castle that Castle should write to him, maybe they can turn this whole thing into another, like, they could work together and make this into a movie or something like that. And Castle's like, yeah, sure. I don't think you're going to have to worry about that with you in jail. And anyway, there's a point where Alexis finds a new trail to go along with during this whole situation with trying to find out about Castle's past. I mean, what Castle did in that time he was gone. It leads Alexis to a military guy. And going, his mom hands her a scrapbook, and Alexis is looking through it, and she ends up seeing a picture of that guy and Haley. Apparently, they know each other. Because previously to this, Haley had told Alexis, "Oh, just drop this. It's better if you don't let your dad, find out about these things." And then she was like, "Just let it go." But the reason why she wants her to let it go is because she has a personal connection in it. She knows the guy that's connected to, who might have some connection to her dad. And basically, she was in the car waiting for Haley was in the car waiting for Alexis. Alexis like, "Are you about to kill me?" Haley's like, almost gives her, "What? No, I'm not going to kill you. What are you talking about?" Alexis doesn't hear this, but Haley tells Castle the truth. She's known about Castle before this whole situation. I thought it was just fascinating. She didn't just randomly come into his life. She knew Castle. Actually, she met him, or she knew about him at the very least during the time he was gone. Because during that time, she was doing some work with MI6, and she got contacted by a guy to look at, and he told her to look after Castle. I mean, that guy being Castle's dad. And Haley kept a pretty good watch on him until the whole CIA thing happened. Until after all that happened, because apparently everything Castle was doing in LA was unrelated to his CIA work, possibly, because by the time he did all his stuff in LA, he had already finished the CIA work, and he just kind of went, in their words, rogue. And since then, Haley lost him and didn't know where he was exactly. It turns out, Castle gave the reason why he never told. And the reason why Haley never told Castle this is because he made her promise. The next time Haley ended up seeing Castle was a little bit before he showed back up in New York after being missing. After he'd been shot on the boat. He had given, sometime a little bit before all that, he gave her a laptop asking her that, if he ever, basically saying if he himself ever came looking for answers, for her not to give him any. Don't, pretend like she doesn't know anything. And she kept that promise. But she also gave him a laptop just in case he himself kept asking questions. And basically it was locked, but Castle figured out the password because it was actually connected to one of his earlier, I don't know whether it was his earlier books or an earlier writing he did earlier in his life. But whatever case may be, he unlocked the computer and him and Haley watched it. And it was basically him telling Castle, basically it was his past self calling him an idiot for diving so deep into this. And it reveals that the reason why he was in LA is because he was tracking down Lockset. Yes, the very same Lockset who went after Kate's team and successfully killed all of them, and is trying to, at one point, tried to kill Beckett until she pretended like she was backing down from the investigation. Last week I couldn't remember his name, but I definitely remembered it this week. I made sure to write it down so I remembered. But that's what led to Castle getting shot, and that's why he had his memories wiped, because he didn't want any of this information getting back to Beckett, because if it got back to Beckett, he knew it would lead to her getting killed. And then in that moment, when he makes this connection and realization, he goes, "Holy crap." And he starts feeling bad because he's like, I'm the reason everything went down. I'm the reason why Beckett's team ended up dead, why Beckett's in danger right now. It's because I went looking for Lockset, and he essentially stirred up the hornet's nest. So pretty big revelation. So it's what Castle's going to do with this new information, we won't really know until March 21st when the show returns. So, but that's all I really want to talk about in this episode. So until next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.